Now let's see what Roosevelt done. Hoover didn't do it. He said there's no constitutional authority. We can show you those documents. But anyway, on March the 6th, Roosevelt issues Order 2038, and he calls for an extraordinary session of Congress to be convened for March the 9th of 1933 to receive the communications from the President. And on that same day, he also issued Proclamation 2039. It's at the bottom. Let's go to the next page. And in that Proclamation 2039 of March the 6th, 1933, what does he say? Whereas it is provided in Section 5B, asterisk, 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 quotation mark, exactly as written by the Federal Reserve Board of New York. Now if we go to 48 Statute 1, Section 2, and what did it say? By any person within the United States or any place subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Now we're beginning to understand. He called for this emergency session of Congress on March 6th, and he issued Proclamation 2039, the bank holiday. It was instituted on March 6th. Congress approved it on March 9th without even reading the bill under emergency session. And that act remains in place to this day. From Hoover's papers, Hoover talking, that those speculators and insiders were right was plain enough later on. This first contact of the money changers with the New Deal netted those who removed their money from the country a profit of up to 60% when the dollar was debased. What had happened to our gold? The gold had already been moved offshore. The gold was not in the banks. So when the people lined up at the door to want their money, what did it do? It exposed it. Okay, a brief review. March the 9th. March the 9th, the American people were declared to be public enemies, and the President, through license or any other form, he could control the actions of the enemies. He made we the people the chattel properties. He seized our gold, our property, and our rights. He suspended the Constitution. And now we see him coming on March the 11th. And we see here that the Secretary of the Treasury, and we know that that current law says that either the President or the Treasury, all proclamations issued heretofore or hereafter are approved and confirmed by Congress automatically, aren't they? So here we see the Secretary of the Treasury will issue license to banks, which are members of the Federal Reserve banks, whether national or state, located in each of the 12 Federal Reserve bank cities, to open Monday morning. Anybody that's got a Black's Law dictionary, go home and get it out and read the bank holiday of 1933. Make a note of that, and it'll tell you exactly that no banks can operate today unless it's under an emergency declared by the President. Make a note and go home and read it. Next slide. So there we see the licensing authority over banks. At the top of the page, May 12th, 1933, to issue license permitting processors, associations of producers, and others engaged in the handling in the current interstate and foreign commerce of any agricultural commodity. May the 12th, licensed agriculture. That's us. That was me. That was some of these farmers that's in this meeting. We've been under that since May the 12th of 1933, actually March the 9th. And we can go on with all of this. And we can go to transportation, communications, securities, oil, labor, industry, the first 100 days of Roosevelt. How many's ever heard of the first 100 days? What did Clinton talk about all during his campaign and afterwards? His first 100 days. This was the nationalization of America in 1933. Next slide. Now, if we know that they took over all contracts and said all contracts are void, as it says here that no contract is considered as valid as between enemies, at least so far as to give them room in the courts of law of either government, and they have in the language of the civil law no ability to sustain a persona standi judicio, they have no personal rights at law, then we should expect that we would see in the statutes some place where they voided, let's say, that contract of that Federal Reserve note that said the Federal Reserve banks had to give us our gold. June the 5th of 1933, House Joint Resolution 192, that every provision contained in or made with respect to any obligation which purports to give the obligee, that's us, a right to require payment in gold or a particular kind of coin or currency or in an amount in money of the United States measured thereby is declared to be against public policy. We'll talk about that in a minute. But here we say, now we have the contract, the Federal Reserve note is invalidated, isn't it? By statute. And we cannot require the banks to now give us our gold back. Next slide. Now just to show an example, on May the 12th, this conference of 50 farm leaders met on March the 10th. That was the day after March the 9th, wasn't it? That's kind of an astute statement. But they agreed on recommendations for a bill which were presented to me, and this is President Roosevelt's notes, which were presented to me at the White House on March the 11th by a committee of the conference who requested me to call upon Congress for the same broad powers to meet the emergency in agriculture as I had requested for solving the banking crisis. What was that broad power? That was the war power, wasn't it? And now we see the farm leaders are asking Roosevelt to use the same war powers to take control of agriculture. Well, needless to say, he did. Next slide. Agricultural Adjustment Act, May the 12th. Declaration of emergency. That the present acute economic emergency being in part the consequence of a severe and increasing disparity between the prices of agriculture and other commodities, which disparity has largely destroyed the purchasing power of farmers for industrial products, has broken down the orderly exchange of commodities, and has seriously impaired the agricultural assets supporting the national credit structure. It is hereby declared that these conditions as a basic industry of agriculture have affected transactions in agriculture commodities with a national public interest, have burdened and obstructed the normal channels of commerce in such commodities, and rendered imperative the immediate enactment of Title I of this Act. Now here we see he's saying that the agricultural assets that support the national credit structure. What did he do? Did he take the titles to all the land? Remember, contracts payable in gold? See, agriculture was critical because of all the millions of acres of farmland out there at this period in time, and the value of that farmland, the mortgage upon that farmland, was what supported the emergency credit. So he had to do something to stabilize the price of land in Federal Reserve banknotes to create the money, didn't he? So he impressed agriculture into the public interest. Remember the Supreme Court case. We were nationalized. Okay, next slide. And we say it is hereby declared to be the policy of Congress, again, to do these things. Next slide. And here we see, in the prize cases, but in defining the meaning of the term enemy's property, we will be led into error if we refer to Fleda or Lord Coke for their definition of the word enemy. It is a technical phrase peculiar to the prize courts and depends upon principles of public policy as distinguished from the common law. Once the emergency is declared, the common law is abolished. The Constitution is abolished, and we fall under the absolute will of government, the public policy. All they need is public opinion on their side. Now, they know that very well. We could pull some slides that would do that, but we're restrained in time. So if they can get public opinion, at least to some degree, on their side, they can pass a statute. Here, the Constitution has no meaning. The Constitution is suspended and has been for 60 years. Now you're beginning to understand. We're not under law. Law has been abolished. We're under a system of public policy. So when you go into that courtroom with your Constitution and the law, the common law in your hand, what does that judge tell you? He says, you have no standing in judicio. No persona standi in judicio, doesn't he? You have no personal standing at law. and don't bring that Constitution into this court. This is not a constitutional court. This is an executive tribunal operating under a different jurisdiction. And we're going to show that jurisdiction in just a few minutes. Next slide. 93-549. Under this procedure, we retain government by law, special temporary law perhaps, but law nonetheless. The public may know the extent and the limitations of the powers that can be asserted, and the persons affected may be informed from the statute of their rights and their duties. Understand that? That the people, the public, may know the extent and limitations of the powers that can be asserted upon them, and the persons affected may be informed from the statute of their rights and their duties. If you have any rights, the only reason you have them is because they have been statutorily declared. And your duties are well spelled out. And if you violate the orders of those statutes, then you will be charged not with a crime, but with an offense. Sound familiar? Next slide. (93-549). Justice Clark speaking. My recollection is that almost every executive order ever issued straddles on several grounds. But it almost always includes the Trading with the Enemy Act, because the language of that act is so broad. They're talking about how does the people challenge? And Justice Clark goes ahead and says, he says it's most difficult from a standpoint of standing to sue. The court, you might say, has enlarged the standing rule in favor of the litigant. But I don't think it has reached the point presently where that would permit many such cases to be litigated to the merits. So then we're saying, well, Congress must act on emergency powers. Senator Church says, what you are saying then is that if Congress doesn't act to standardize, restrict, or eliminate the emergency powers, that no one else is very likely to get a standing in court to contest. No persona standi in judicio. The enemy has no right to bring an action in the court. Next slide. Let's go at the middle of the page. Talking about agriculture again, the interesting aspect of the legislation lies in the fact that it created a permanent agency designed to eradicate an emergency condition in the sphere of agriculture. A permanent agency. These agencies that were created, and ended up being thousands of them, were not created as temporary agencies until the war terminated. They were created as permanent agencies. Roosevelt said, we will never go back to the old order. Next slide. 93-549 on the right-hand side of the page. Mr. Church speaking, Senator Church. If the President can create crimes by fiat and without congressional approval, our system is not much different from that of the communist, which allegedly threatens our existence. Is there a difference? None. See, they recognize, go back to that same slide. We won't read it, but just to give you a flavor, look right there at the bottom of that right-hand side. Enormous scope of powers, a time bomb. This is their own documents, people. Go ahead. Now, Title III of the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Most people wouldn't look in agriculture for a lot of these things, but look at Title III. It's called the Emergency Farm Mortgage Act of 1933, but look. Financing and exercising power conferred by Section 8 of Article 1 of the Constitution to coin the money and regulate the value thereof. Now, we all read our Constitution and say Congress has the authority to coin the money and regulate the value thereof, don't they? Well, how can it be that the Executive Department is issuing an emergency currency? Let's see. Section 43, whenever the President finds upon investigation that the foreign commerce of the United States is adversely affected, and so on, an expansion of credit is necessary to secure by international agreement a stabilization at proper levels of the currencies of various governments, the President is authorized in his discretion to direct the Secretary of the Treasury, so on, to enter into agreements with the Federal Reserve Banks. Let's go to the next slide. And under Section 1, to direct the Secretary of the Treasury to cause to be issued in such amount or amounts as he may from time to time order United States notes, as provided in an act entitled An Act to Authorize the Issue of United States Notes and for the Redemption of Funding thereof and for funding the floating debt of the United States, approved February the 25th of 1862. That's in the Agricultural Adjustment Act of Title III. What is that act of February the 25th, 1862? That was the Greenback Act of Lincoln. Remember our history? Lincoln was elected president, he was inaugurated, and he didn't even have a Congress for 6 weeks, did he? He didn't call that extraordinary session of Congress. He issued money, he declared war, he suspended the habeas corpus, he was an absolute dictatorship. There was not even a Congress in session. For 6 weeks, he prosecuted that entire war, all by himself. And when Congress came into session 6 weeks later, you know what they said? The actions, rules, regulations, license, heretofore or hereafter taken, are hereby approved and confirmed. The exact language of March 9, 1933, Title 12, U.S.C., Section 95B today. Make sense? Next slide. Now, how do we terminate? We can show you various different acts. This happens to be the Agricultural Act. This title shall cease to be in effect whenever the President finds and proclaims that the national economic emergency in relation to agriculture has been ended. 48 Statute 1, whenever the President finds by proclamation that the proclamation issued on March the 6th of 1933 has terminated, it has to terminate through presidential proclamation just as it came into effect. Congress has already delegated all of that authority. Next slide. So here we find in 93-549 Congress talking. We now find ourselves in a position where we cannot reclaim the power without the President's acquiescence. We are unable to terminate these declarations without the President's signature. So we need a large measure of presidential cooperation. That is one problem that I pose. It appears as though the presidents are not wanting to give up the power, and if they don't sign the termination, it doesn't terminate. At least it hasn't happened for 60 years. Now that's no sign that Slick Willie won't do it, but I rather doubt it. But how many times have we asked him to terminate it? Who all here in this group has asked him to do it? How many has demanded that he do it? How many even knew he'd done it? We weren't taught, were we? And you see, as long as we remain ignorant, how long do you think we could remain under this thing? Maybe forever, couldn't we? But we're not quite as ignorant now as we were, are we? Next slide. Just a point. These powers, if exercised, would confer upon the President total authority to do anything he pleases. 93-549. Next slide. Now, Department of Justice writing in executive replies when they've done all of these studies about terminating this national emergency. As a consequence, a national emergency is now a practical necessity in order to carry out what has become the regular and normal method of governmental actions. What were intended by Congress as delegations of power to be used only in the most extreme situations and for the most limited durations have become everyday powers, and a state of emergency has become a permanent condition. Department of Justice, May the 21st of 1973. That's our Attorney General writing. Next slide. 1935, the Supreme Court, in the Agricultural Adjustment Act, Butler versus United States says, a tax in the general understanding and in the strict constitutional sense is an exaction for the support of government. The term does not connote the expropriation of money from one group to be expended for another as a necessary means in a plan of regulation, such as the plan for regulating agricultural production. Understand what they said? A tax can only be an exaction for the support of government in a strict constitutional sense, and it cannot be an exaction or an appropriation from one group to be expended for the use of another. That would be socialism, wouldn't it? Next slide. And the regulation of farmers' activities under the statute, though in form subject to his own will, is in fact coercion through economic pressure. His right of choice is illusory. Even if a farmer's consent were purely voluntary, the act would stand no better. At best, it is a scheme for purchasing with federal funds submission to federal regulation of a subject reserved to the states. Talking about the contracts. Those contracts are coercion contracts. Those are adhesion contracts made by a superior over an inferior. Those are under the belligerent capacity of government over enemies. Those are not valid contracts. We're leading up to something. Next slide. Same case, Butler versus United States. If the novel view of the general welfare clause now advanced in support of the tax were accepted, this clause would not only enable Congress to supplant the states in the regulation of agriculture and all other industries as well, but would furnish the means whereby all of the other provisions of the Constitution, sedulously framed to define and limit the powers of the United States and preserve the powers of the states, could be broken down, the independence of the individual states obliterated, and the United States converted into a central government exercising uncontrolled police power throughout the Union, superseding all local control over local concerns. The United States Supreme Court ruled the New Deal, the nationalization, unconstitutional in the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And they turned it down, flat. They said it's unconstitutional. You're turning the federal government into an uncontrolled police state, exercising uncontrolled police power. What did Roosevelt do next? He stacked the court, didn't he? And in 1937, they overturned Butler. And here we went. Next slide. Now, the existence of war and the restoration of peace are to be determined by the political department of the government. And such determination is binding and conclusive upon the courts, and deprives the courts of the power of hearing proof and determining the question of fact either that war exists or has ceased to exist. The courts will tell you it's a political decision. It's a political question. We do not have jurisdiction over the common law. Is Dennis Smith in here? What'd they tell you, Dennis? Word for word. This court has no jurisdiction over the common law. Right? Last week. Okay. It's a political question. The courts were deprived of the Constitution. They were deprived of the common law. They are now courts of prize over the enemies. And we have no standing persona standi in judicio. And don't get too upset because we're going to come with a remedy. (93-549). Just how effective the limitation on crisis action this makes the court is hard to say. In light of the recent war, the court today would seem to be a fairly harmless observer of the emergency activities of the President and Congress. It is highly unlikely that the separation of powers and the 10th Amendment will be called upon again to hamstring the efforts of the government to deal resolutely with a serious national emergency. Surely never again will this country call upon the separation of powers and the 10th Amendment to hamstring the efforts of the government to deal with the 60-year-old emergency we're under. Emergency administration. Organizationally, in dealing with the Depression, it was Roosevelt's general policy to assign new emergency functions to newly created agencies rather than to already existing departments. This is an entire study in itself. But what is this bloated federal bureaucracy? These thousands of emergency agencies sitting out there with emergency functions to rule you in all cases whatsoever. Right? There it is. Next slide. Now, let's understand just a little bit about the courts. Bouviers. Goods taken on land from a public enemy are called booty. And the distinction between the prize and a booty consists in this, that the former is taken at sea and the latter on land. Okay? Now the prize is a capture on the water. Remember, Congress shall have the power to make rules on all captures on the land and the water. Captures on the water are prize. Captures on the land are booty. Now, the Constitution also says that Congress shall have the power to provide and maintain a navy. Right? Even during peacetime, can't they? And it says that Congress shall have the power to raise and support an army. But no appropriations of money for that purpose shall be for greater than 2 years. Right? So you see that the army is not a permanent standing body, is it? Inland. Why? Because the armies in times of peace were held by who? The sovereign states, the militia. So the United States federal government had a navy during peacetime or during wartime. But during times of peace, there was no standing army. We had the individual state militias. Okay? So consequently, the federal government had a standing prize court, didn't it? Through the Navy over the water. But in times of peace, there could be no federal police power over the continental United States within the states, could there? Because they had no army. Starting to make sense? So there was a distinction between the prize and the booty. Next slide. Okay, this comes from the law of civil governments and territories subject to military occupations by military forces of the United States. Next slide. The confiscation of private property of enemies in war. Next slide. At the top. Should the President desire to utilize the services of the federal courts of the United States in promoting this purpose or military undertaking, since these courts derive their jurisdiction from Congress and do not constitute a part of the military establishment, they must secure from Congress the necessary action to confer such jurisdiction upon said courts. If we're going to confiscate within the continental United States on the land the booty, then we have to have a statutory authority, don't we? Next section, at 5. The laws and usages of war make a distinction between enemy's property captured on the sea and property captured on land. The jurisdiction of the courts of the United States over property captured at sea is held not to attach to property captured on land in the absence of congressional action. There is no standing prize court over the land. Once the war is declared, the Congress has to give that jurisdiction to some court over the captures on the land. The right of confiscation is a sovereign right. In times of peace, the exercise of this right is limited and controlled by the domestic constitution and institutions of the government. In times of war, when the right is exercised against enemy's property as a war measure, such right becomes a belligerent right, and as such is not subject to the restrictions imposed by domestic institutions, but is regulated and controlled by the laws and usages of war. So you see, our government can operate in two capacities. Number one, in its sovereign peacetime capacity, but there it is limited by the Constitution and all of the restrictions that we the people placed upon that government. But in times of war, it operates in its belligerent capacity. And there it is governed by the laws of war and not by the Constitution. Next slide. Section 17 of the Act of October the 6th, 1917, the Trading with the Enemy Act, that the district courts of the United States are hereby given jurisdiction to make and enter all such rules as to notice and otherwise, and all such orders and decrees, and to issue such process as may be necessary and proper in the premises to enforce the provisions of this act. Here we have Congress conferring upon the district courts of the United States the booty jurisdiction, the jurisdiction over enemy property within the continental United States. When the American people on March the 9th of 1933 were declared to be the public enemies, what jurisdiction were they placed under? The jurisdiction of Section 17 of the Trading with the Enemy Act of March the 6th, 1917. Don't bring that Constitution into my court. This is not a court of law. Next slide. Public Law 94-412, 1976, September the 14th. Congress finished their extensive, literally thousands of pages of study on the national emergencies. And at Public Law 94-412, they said, we're going to terminate the existing national emergencies. And there it is, they done it. Good. Next slide. But the last section of the Act, Section 502, says A, the provisions of this Act shall not apply to the following provisions of law, the powers and authorities conferred thereby, and actions taken thereunder. 1. Section 5B of the Act of October the 6th, 1917, as amended. Hallelujah. Next slide. Now let's go back to 1774, the Declaration of Rights. This was the first document that our forefathers sent to the King and Parliament of Great Britain 2 years prior to the Declaration of Independence. And let's read. Whereas, since the close of the last war, and you see they're not arguing during the war, are they? But they're saying after the war was over, the British Parliament, claiming a power of right to bind the people of America by statute in all cases whatsoever, hath in some acts expressly imposed taxes on them, and in others under various pretenses, but in fact for the purpose of raising a revenue, hath imposed rates and duties payable in these colonies, established a board of commissioners with unconstitutional powers, and extended the jurisdiction of the courts of the admiralty, not only for collecting the said duties, but for the trial of causes merely arising within the body of a county. They extended the jurisdiction of the admiralty inland after the war was over, and they claimed the power of right to bind the people of America by statute in all cases whatsoever. Where are we at today? We came full circle, didn't we? We came right back to where we started. Now here we sit. But we had one section in that Constitution that we haven't talked about yet. Who's got their constitutions with them? Everybody that's got their constitutions, hold them up. Article 3, Section 3. Okay. Treason against the United States shall consist only in one thing, in levying war against them, or in giving aid and comfort to their enemies. The Act of March 9th, 1933 was what? It was a declaration of war upon who? The American people and the states. They're the criminals, not us. Now don't ever forget that. We're not the bad people here, because we done nothing wrong. All we done was walked up to the bank and said, here's your note, give us our gold. They'd taken the gold. It was already gone. And to cover up their acts, they fraudulently misquoted that act. Asterisk, 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 quotation marks. And who wrote that proclamation?
The Federal Reserve.
And who implemented it? President Roosevelt. And Congress ratified it on March the 9th. And who was Roosevelt on March the 3rd? He was governor of New York, wasn't he? And they used that act to cover up what had happened, and we the people were too ignorant to know it. And we live under that act to this day. Now, people, it's went far enough. We've got the evidence, their own documents, but we didn't have the knowledge. They kept running us around in circles. We didn't know how they was doing what they was doing. Now we've got to focus. We've got to get ourselves organized, and we've got to build ourselves an army of we the people. And when we have it, then we say enough is enough. We want our country back. We want our Constitution back. We don't need any applause yet because we haven't got it yet. We've now got the challenge before us, and it's going to take all of us, and I mean all of us. It's going to take your neighbors, your friends, and everybody else, because we've got to reawaken this country. We've got to have a reawakening to regain the knowledge of freedom that we lost, that our forefathers knew on 1774, and we didn't even know what freedom was. Okay, now, questions, answers, comments, whatever.
Knowledge is power. If you wish to help Dr. Schreoder build an army of concerned, patriotic Americans who are willing to become informed about these vital issues, if you're willing to use that knowledge to help restore our Constitution and its precious freedoms for the sake of our children and grandchildren, contact Dr. Gene Schreoder, American Agriculture Movement, Campo, Colorado, 81029. And thank you for listening.